Some places feel distant, not because of how far away they are, but because of how little they seem to acknowledge human presence. Tonight, with a cup of coffee and an open mind, we travel to the far western edge of Scotland, beyond familiar coastlines, beyond sheltered waters, to a small and unforgiving cluster of islands known as the Flannan Isles. Here, the Atlantic Ocean does not arrive gently. It collides with rock, withdraws and returns again, shaped by wind and time, rather than intention. The sea here is not hostile in the way stories describe. It is simply indifferent. In December of 1900, a lighthouse standing on the largest of these islands, Flannan Moor, went dark, and 3 men vanished. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was never intended to be welcoming. It was designed for endurance. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, and heavy iron doors were built to resist storms that could rise without warning. Life at the station followed a strict routine shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Isolation was not a flaw of the assignment. It was the assignment. The men stationed there understood this. Their names were Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. They were experienced lighthouse keepers, not reckless men, not unfamiliar with danger. They knew how weather could shift without warning, how the sea could change character within minutes, and how responsibility did not disappear simply because no one was watching. Each day followed a familiar rhythm. The lamp was trimmed and cleaned. Weather conditions were recorded. Equipment was inspected. Meals were prepared. Long hours passed quietly, marked only by wind, waves, and the calls of seabirds. Waiting was part of the job. By early December, storms began to move through the region. Supply ships were delayed, which was not unusual for this stretch of coastline. The men on Flannan Moor would have expected this. They had provisions, they had shelter, and most importantly, they had the lighthouse. The light was expected to shine regardless of conditions. But when the relief vessel Hesperus finally approached the island after several days of delay, its crew noticed something deeply unsettling. There was no light, no beam cutting through the mist, no steady glow marking the island's position, only darkness where certainty should have been. Attempts were made to signal the lighthouse. Horns echoed across the water. Flags were raised. No response came back. Silence answered every call. Relief keeper Joseph Moore volunteered to go ashore. As the small boat approached the rocky landing point, Moore later described a sense of unease that he struggled to put into words. The wind was strong, yet the island felt unnaturally still, as if something had already happened and the place was waiting. Climbing the narrow path toward the lighthouse, Moore expected signs of life. A door opening, a figure stepping outside, smoke rising from a chimney. There was nothing. When he reached the door and entered the station, what he found was not chaos, but something far more disturbing. Order. The rooms were intact. Furniture stood where it belonged. Personal belongings were undisturbed. A meal appeared partially prepared, as though interrupted. An overturned chair rested nearby. One heavy oilskin, essential protection against winter seas, was missing. But the men were gone. The absence itself was unsettling. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no damage inside the living quarters. The lighthouse had not been abandoned in panic. It had been left incomplete. The logbook offered little clarity. Entries mentioned storms and difficult conditions, but nothing extraordinary. No warning, no farewell. The final pages were simply blank, as though time itself had stopped writing. Outside, investigators found damage near the landing area. Heavy equipment had been displaced. Wooden boxes were broken or moved. Iron railings were bent and twisted. Evidence suggested that waves had reached higher than expected. From this, the most widely accepted explanation emerged: a rogue wave. The theory is simple. One keeper stepped outside to inspect storm damage near the lower landing. A sudden surge struck, sweeping him toward the sea. The others followed instinctively, attempting a rescue. In moments, all three were lost to the Atlantic. It is a logical explanation, and perhaps the most realistic, but it does not answer every question. Why was the lighthouse door secured? Why was only one oilskin missing? Why was no trace of the men ever recovered? The sea often returns what it takes. Here, it returned nothing. Other explanations surfaced over time. Some suggested an improbable attack by seabirds, though no physical evidence supported this idea. Others turned to local folklore, pointing to the island's long reputation as a place of unease, spoken of cautiously by sailors long before the lighthouse existed. Stories of ancient presences and restless spirits found their way into retellings of the event, not because they were proven, but because silence invites imagination. When facts end, stories begin. What remains undeniable is the absence of certainty. No bodies were found, no debris washed ashore, no definitive timeline was established. The lighthouse was eventually staffed again, but those who followed spoke quietly of discomfort, of strange sounds carried by the wind, of a feeling that the place remembered what had happened. They kept the light burning. They did their work, and they left when their rotations ended. No one stayed longer than necessary. More than a century later, the disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers remains unresolved, not because the truth is hidden, but because the sea does not explain itself. Sometimes it simply takes what it wants and leaves us with questions. This has been Night Archive. Thank you for listening.